I was gonna do a more philosophical video about pride and its conflation with hubris by Christianity. I did do all the research and everything. And don't worry, I did far too much research to not make that video. It's still coming. But then, the lovely Shannon Q inadvertently brought this monstrosity to my attention on Twitter. So, let's do this. Kairate! It's been tough the last couple of days. Everyone has something to say about the recent events, from the deaths of Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Eric Reason, Dominique Playton, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and George Floyd, to the brutal police response to the protest-turned-riots that followed. Last night, as of this recording, Seattle was shut down, and protesters were tear-gassed and shot with rubber bullets, having only been given 10 minutes to abide by a curfew set without warning. Similar stories can be found in many major cities across the country. I know I watched the news live stream of what was going on in Seattle. Tensions are high between police and communities of color, who have been terrorized by unchecked police brutality for over a century. Which, of course, brings us to Mr. Comfort, who, if I take this article at face value, appears to have his head shoved so far up his own rectum that even the jaws of life could not free it. From the very title of his article, America's Race Riots, the Cause and Cure, he claims a privileged knowledge that none of the rest of us possess. He's got the cure, everyone! Of course, that would pique the interest of anyone seeking comfort in these desperate times. Okay, yeah, go ahead, shoot me in the comments section. Even though this is my first video, I've got a pretty good idea of who would have an interest in clicking on it, so I don't have to tell you all that whatever hope there might have been was dashed from the opening lines. But I think there's worth an examining not only why he's wrong, but how the article itself is constructed to manipulate the emotions of the reader, so they're less likely to notice he's wrong if they fit the demographic that would listen to him. So let's get into it. The first tract I ever published was written way back in 1973. An elderly Presbyterian minister insisted on purchasing a hand-crank printer and gifting it to me. I was a little mystified as to why he did that, however, I wrote a tract called Sin Not Skin. It was about racism and how humanity misdiagnoses the disease. They think the problem is skin, when it is more than skin deep. It is the heart of man that is desperately wicked, not his skin. Skin color simply sparks the fire of prejudice and racial hatred within the human heart. Someone read what I had written, liked it, and ordered 5,000 tracts that I had to crank out by hand. Funny how he opens an article about America's race riots by talking about himself, right? Seems a bit more hubris on Old Comfort's part. What he's doing here is trying to establish rapport with the reader with his hook. Look, I was talking about racism back before it was cool. He's trying to eliminate the obvious objection that might come to mind when an educated reader picks up an article by a white evangelical Christian promising a cure to racism. Also, note the little humble brag at the end there? I sold 5,000 tracts of the first thing that I'd ever written. Look how awesome I am. By the way, if you guys are interested in me digging up that Sin Not Skin and anybody's got a source for it, there's gonna be a link to my Discord in the description below. Pop on there or in the comments section and let me know. I might do a video on it. It's really up to you guys. Nearly 50 years later, the world is still beating the same drum, and once again we have race riots in our country reminiscent of the out-of-control Los Angeles race riots of 1992. Those riots, initially sparked by sinful men who were captured on video beating a black man. That was then fueled by more sinful men and women who saw this opportunity to run riot and steal, kill, and destroy. 63 people tragically lost their precious lives in those riots, and thousands more were injured. Now, I was only a year old when the LA riots happened, so this is more of a historical venture for me than one of memory. Thankfully, NPR has a pretty detailed article out talking about the riots and their 25th anniversary. All my sources, including the original article from Comfort, will be linked in the description, including this one. So when I'm referencing information about the riots, everything here is coming from that article. According to that article, in March of 1991, Rodney King was on parole for robbery and led 4 officers on a high-speed chase through LA. When the cops stopped him, he was ordered out of the car, and LAPD officers kicked and beat him with batons for 15 minutes, while other officers stood by watching and commenting. He suffered skull fractures, broken bones and teeth, and permanent brain damage. A resident across the street captured the incident on a home camcorder, and the officers were eventually charged with excessive use of force. However, the jury ultimately acquitted them, sparking riots across LA less than 3 hours later that lasted for days. Keep in mind, racial tensions were already high at the time due to a Korean shopkeep who murdered a young black woman, Latasha Harlins, who, according to the same article, was shot dead still clutching the money she was going to use to pay for the orange juice she was purportedly trying to steal. The store owner received probation and a $500 fine. Let that sink in. The unemployment rate in the area was up to 50% at the time as well, and a drug epidemic ravaged the area, and gang activity was high. Which is understandable given the economic problems in the area. Often, people turn to crime when they can't make money legitimately. Conditions today mirror those the rioters in LA found themselves in. With new innovations in technology making it ever easier to showcase the extent of the problem, it seems natural that without justice, things would hit a breaking point, and current American unemployment sits around 40% due to the pandemic. Coming back to Comfort's article, he blames man's sinful nature for both the riots and King's beating, without actually acknowledging any of the systemic problems or surrounding racial tensions leading up to this point. Instead of looking at the larger picture, he's content to use loaded language and to lay the blame on humanity, rather than the corrupt system and hostile conditions that ultimately lead to rioting. It continues a historical pattern of individualizing systemic issues in order to ignore the larger patterns at play and placate a predominantly white audience who might have their feelings hurt by suggesting they're part of the problem. At the risk of overquoting MLK here,
I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity.
Mankind is a vicious pit bull looking for any opportunity to break free from the restraint of the law. Could you imagine if the law was completely removed from society and was left up to the goodness of men to stop them from R-ing, stealing, and murdering? Imagine if there were no punishment for theft or R. It is then that we would see the wicked nature of humanity. Mr. Comfort, there often isn't a punishment for at least one of those crimes. I'll let my audience figure out which one I'm referring to. But the argument that the law is the only thing deterring people from doing terrible things is an often repeated one worth exploring here. Try to imagine hurting somebody random off the street. Like, really get into it. Imagine their pain and everything. Chances are, the moment I suggested that, some part of you recoiled at the idea, unless you've been trained in the military or somewhere else and desensitized to violence. Why? Well, humans are social animals, and other social animals, including rats, will often choose to forgo rewards regardless of punishments when they know their fellow rats are suffering or excluded. Humans have really complex ways of justifying harm to one another, think of the fog of war and such, but more often than not, it isn't fear of punishment by the law that prevents humans from harming each other. It's empathy, the desire for cooperation, and the fear of social ostracization. A human alone won't fare very well in the wild. There's a link in the description to an article in Philosophical Transactions, Biological Sciences that talks at length about empathy as a driver for prosocial behavior in humans and other animals. It's well worth the read. But note also how he conflates stealing, assault, and murder here. One of these things is not like the others. Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, said this week during the riots in his state, "Civil society is not maintained just by laws and the threat of punishments, it's maintained by a sense of social compact, that we share the same values. The problem is we no longer share the same values. There was a time in America where adultery, pornography, homosexuality, abortion, fornication, and blasphemy were frowned upon, because most Americans respected the Ten Commandments and had a semblance of the fear of God. No longer. Today, these sins are not shunned, they are celebrated. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. There are said to be no moral absolutes of right and wrong. What we are seeing played out is the godless idea of evolution in practice. It is simply survival of the fittest where the lion devours the lamb. So the godless world shouldn't complain when others push the lawlessness envelope a little further than they have. Ooh boy. I find it interesting how he conflates expressions of sexuality with murder indirectly here. Remember how he pressed murder and sexual assault above? Blasphemy and fornication are on the list of 10 commandments, but pornography and homosexuality weren't even mentioned. Neither was abortion. Dunno what any of these things have to do with police brutality or racism, apart from the observation that gay and trans people of color have a much higher risk of violence against them, especially by the police. But I don't think that that's the point being made by Old Comfort here. Just saying. Kind of feels like a soapbox he just felt like standing on for a minute. Then we move on to the meat of the paragraph. Here we have an appeal to nostalgia. Some unspecified time ago, things were better. But better for who, though? Because if we go back more than 60 years, we're looking at Jim Crow, and much further than that, those pious Christians used the same book he just referenced in this article to justify slavery and the inferiority of the same people that are still being oppressed by police today. According to Time magazine, there are two major passages that were used to justify this. The first was Genesis 9, verses 18 through 27, which is up on the screen for you to read. It's a bit long. The story is of Noah's sons seeing him naked, and one of them not doing anything about it. So he curses one of his grandkids to forever be enslaved to the descendants of the other two. The article points out that in churches at the time, Canaan was dropped from the story and Ham was made black, which became known as the Curse of Ham. All black people are Ham's descendants, and all lighter-skinned people are descendants of Japheth and Shem, so their purpose was to serve. Yay! Oh, racism. The other verse comes from the New Testament in Ephesians 6:5-7. In it, Paul tells the servants and slaves who are Christians to serve their master as they would Yahweh because they'll be rewarded in heaven for doing so. Yikesy stuff. The article goes on to quote two bishops who defended slavery as part of Yahweh's work converting and civilizing Africa. I linked the article below if you want to go read those quotes. Suffice to say, they're pretty nasty. The point is, this mythical time where Christian values somehow united people and eliminated slavery never existed. If anything, the very text he's trying to get his readers to unite behind was used to justify abuses as bad as, or significantly worse, than those being protested on the streets. It's a horrendous whitewashing of history that ignores the very real suffering of people of color and the way the Bible was at the forefront of its justification. Also, don't even get me started on the Christianizing of the savage Native American tribes like my own. We'll go there in another video if you want to hear more about that. Language is used here in such a way as to construct this mythical better time in the minds of his white Christian readers, a time they might have considered better, but no other group could say the same. Alright, this next bit is fairly long, but it needs to be read all at once for full context, so bear with me. I have often used an analogy from an experience I had many years ago that illustrates the only way that we can deal with this apparent problem of racism. We had a persistent spider that left a large web across the front wall of our home. Day after day, I would brush the web away, and the next day it would be back. One day I had the revelation that I was more intelligent than the spider. So I grabbed a can of insect repellent and a small stick, tapped on the web, and skillfully made the noise of a fly in distress. Sure enough, the spider came out from his hiding place, thinking he was getting a free lunch, and I killed him with the insect repellent. Racism is the web, the spider is the sinful nature of man that conceals itself, and the stick is the rod of Moses. It is the moral law, the 10 Commandments, that brings the spider from his hiding. It shows the sinner to be a lying, thieving, hateful, blasphemous, fornicating rebel at his heart. And the insect repellent is the gospel that puts evil nature to death. Yeah, it took you a revelation there, Ray old buddy, to figure out you were smarter than a spider. That takes some talent. I mean, I thought the Holy Spirit might have better things to do. That's what you guys think that those revelations come from, right? Anyway, that's a lot to unpack. I could point out the obvious that Mosaic law consisted of a lot more than 10 commandments, and that some of them had to do with the so-called proper way to keep slaves, but let's not go for the easy point here. He's cementing his claim that the Bible possesses some magical racism-erasing property that, once studied, and the studier is dunked in water, will rid the world of suffering. What he's ignoring is that many of the people perpetuating these crimes are Christian and would use the Bible's passages on punishment as justification for their brutal actions against people of color, whom they've been trained from a young age to see as criminals. Also, it's accurate to say the Bible portrays the average person as a lying, hating, thieving, etc. rebel at heart, but in no way does it show or prove this to be the case. If it did, we wouldn't need entire fields of psychiatry and psychology to figure out how our brains tick and how best to treat the problems that arise from them. Nope, just pop open a Bible and every murderer, thief, liar, assaulter, etc. would miraculously cease their activities. But this is where we get to the part that really grinds my gears. Dear Christian, don't get caught up in the fight against racism. Instead, go for its cause. Continue to use the law to expose sin and then put it to death with the love of God revealed in the cross. Those who are Christ's crucify that sinful nature. This is a dark time in history, but keep your light shining. Your labor is never in vain in the Lord. Yeah, Christians, don't get caught up trying to change the system that oppresses people. Don't be empathetic and loving and all those things Yahweh claims you should be. Instead, obsess over the Bible and judge them and those who hurt them with the same severity, and continue to pass the blame off on the nature of humanity. This, right here, this conclusion, is why I had to make this video. Because this is where the real harm lies. This article paints a mythical world in which the Bible is perfect and humans who abide by it become perfect as well, and washes away centuries of historical evidence to the contrary. And the rallying cry of, "It was the sinners misusing the word," can't just apply here. The Bible itself justifies slavery and gives specific orders as to how it can be properly carried out, both in the Old and New Testaments. It wasn't that long ago that folks were fighting for their lives in the streets for basic human rights. It was a few days ago that police kneeled on a man's neck and suffocated him to death as he begged for his life. The Bible's wide availability and near universal education on its contents from birth has done nothing to deter that, and will continue to do nothing so long as people refuse to acknowledge the cause of systemic injustice. Racism cannot be cured by the Bible, and people like comfort peddling platitudes to their flock are doing far more harm than they realize. The Bible itself becomes a tool of harm when preachers assure their followers that this world is temporary and that the afterlife will be both better and forever, thereby passing along the responsibility for fixing these injustices onto the people suffering from them. You'd think that a loving Christian person would want to try to fight alongside somebody for equal rights, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. If anything, Ray shows his hand that he's far more interested in continuing the status quo than he is in actually loving or helping anybody. This article, as of my writing, has over 7,000 shares directly from the page. I don't know if 7,000 people will even see this video. If you'd like to help me with that, please like and share on your own favorite social media platform. Subscribe if you enjoyed it, and stare at the notification bell until it either rings itself or beats you in the staring contest. Then click the dang thing, because of course it's not going to ring itself. Special thanks to Shannon Q for her post that brought this to my attention, and Gaelic Knox, who did the art I use on both my channel page and the avatars for this video. Also, special thanks to Callan and Chrissy H and Aaron, who all decided to help me out with reviewing the script, and pointed out a couple of things that I missed. Remember everyone, faith ain't fear.